Well, just when Gautengers thought that the e-toll battle was behind them, the courts have controversially overturned the original ruling, which puts them back on the table. Now, while commuters may feel that they've been taxed to death and tolls are just one step too far, the cover story from Finweek suggests that Sanral may not be the villain they're made out to be. With government not spending on South African roads and not much of the existing infrastructure, it may just make sense for Sanral to play a bigger part in the South African road story. Joining us now at the desk for more, Finweek journalist Jessica Hubbard and the DA's Shadow Transport Minister Ian Ollis. Thanks for joining us today, Mark. Let's start off with you as always. A great cover. Talk to us about why you've chosen to take this particular stance.
Well, I have to be honest, it was quite a controversial discussion internally. I mean, I think if you think about Sanral, we often just, your hackles are up. As a consumer, your hackles are immediately up. I think we all really celebrated when Sanral essentially lost its battle for the e-toll, the original battle for the e-tolls. But I think looking at what James unpacked in the story this week, they actually do have a role to play. And I think when you take the emotive side out of it from the consumer and you sit there and you think, well, what is the role of managing South African road infrastructure? I think it is very, very important that we look at this organisation that is effectively doing it very, very well. And I think maybe we'll put some questions to Ian shortly, but I think some of the interesting things that came out of this was that government departments are still underspending on road infrastructure, huge backlog sitting there, and a large number of the gravel roads are essentially falling apart. And I think what's very interesting for me was James touches on the issue that originally our road infrastructure was set up to accommodate 4 million consumers or passengers essentially. Now essentially you've got the cities that are trying to be connected.
Post-apartheid, obviously.
Post-apartheid, you've now got 50 million people trying to use infrastructure that was maybe set up for 4 million people. And I think you've got to, it's a fundamental discussion that needs to be take place in South Africa. And I mean, I come from the airport quite often and you see the Gautrain and you see it packed up. South African consumers want really good transport, and they will use it once it's a proven concept. And I think that this is for me quite an interesting thing. How does South Africa change from being a very lumpy car-driven type of society, at least in the middle class, to something that engages and uses real public transport? And I think good public transport effectively impacts us as retail or consumers. It impacts cost of doing business. I mean, we know that we're not the most productive or successful society when it comes to managing and moving goods around. You think about our ports, for instance. I mean, one of the big problems there is we actually just can't move stuff through them fast enough. So transport is such an interesting topic, and I think what James has done here is suddenly he's taken one of those quite controversial views, he's turned it around and he said, look at it from another perspective.
And Ian, let's bring you into the conversation because Sanral, of course, is a private sector body that has been set up by the public sector, and the issue here is that you've got legacy issues as a result of the apartheid era, and then you've got a government right now that is not delivering on many fronts, and the transport infrastructure is just one of them. So where do you stand with regards to Sanral right now?
Well, look, Sanral is very good at project managing large projects, and I would compliment them. In fact, I think Nazir Ali does a great job of project managing. The problem with the e-toll and Sanral has been that the politicians that are supposed to present these projects to the public and manage the public participation process have abdicated that responsibility back to Sanral and said, no, Sanral, you deal with it. Now, Sanral are a group of engineers and project managers. They're not public relations people. And when you make engineers responsible for dealing with the public and explaining to the public what's going on, it really goes awry very quickly. And that's been the big problem here with the e-toll, is that the way the public was informed what's going to happen was extremely badly handled, but it's a political problem. Politicians like the MEC for Transport in Gauteng and the Minister of Transport.
That's why he fell, Spoon Ndebele, he's no more.
Well, that's exactly one of the reasons why he fell. You've got former and current Transport Minister, former and current MEC for Transport in Gauteng, who have abdicated that responsibility to officials. You can't do that as a politician. You need to be a leader. You need to be out in the front. You need to be saying to the public, this is what's happening the whole way through the process. It never happened, and the public found out too late that the process was botched. The problem is not with the implementing body, Sanral. The problem is with the politicians who ran away and hid and said it was somebody else's problem and never came up right to the front and said to the public, this is what it's going to cost you per kilometre, per day, per month, etc. And the public found out kind of later really what the financial implications are. That's a political problem, and it was really badly managed.
Maybe if I can jump in here. I mean, if you talking about it as a leadership issue, I mean, do you think much of it has been driven by ANC policy conference coming up this year? Nobody wants to be seen as the bad guy in this. They're essentially saying, I'll go with public sentiment for it, and I'll kind of play the card that I know what I actually want to achieve in terms of our transport infrastructure, but I'd rather go with the populist vote at the moment?
You know, that point was made in a way by journalists saying that it was a poisoned chalice given to the Deputy President to now solve the problem in the year when he may be challenging the President for the leadership of the ANC. So there is some political positioning going on clearly, and I think I agree to an extent with journalists who are saying you hand the Deputy President this difficult problem to solve just before the Mangaung province conference. It makes it difficult for him to come out looking like the good guy. Gauteng motorists are very upset about the e-toll, and in our view as the DA, the e-toll should not be implemented.
Okay, so let's take a look at other options, because it's not done and dusted. We still got that High Court ruling in November.
Yes.
Jessica, your views on this, the other options that we've got, because Nazir Ali last year said that the backlog when it comes to road maintenance will cost the country around 149 billion rand. That's a lot of money. So of course you've got the e-tolling as one option, then you've also got ring fencing, a fuel levy. What are your thoughts on those other options?
I think, for one, the public does need to accept that they're going to have to pay in some way for the improvement of the roads if they want the roads to be maintained. So there is a cost involved, and as Ian was pointing out, that cost does need to be communicated more clearly. So there's a big part for communication, and I would agree with James that ring fencing the fuel levy is a good option. It just needs to be unpacked for the public and explained in the right way. It can't just be dumped on the public and sort of shocked and awed. You know, it needs to be a process of educating the public, showing them this is what is going to be done and this is why it needs to be done. And I think you'll find more public acceptance of the whole concept that way.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Our policy position is that instead of an e-toll, what we should have is long-term ring fencing of all the fuel levies. In the Finweek article, it talks about over 40 billion rand per year that is taken from the public through fuel levies. Now, what happens to that 46 billion rand? It goes into the central pot and can be spent, for example, on bailing out SAA when they get into trouble and need another 6 billion bailout, for example.
Or
we
Denel
think that is exactly Denel. We think that's shocking. What you should do is take the money from the public through the fuel levy, yes, because you have to pay for it somehow, then ring fence it and spend it on the roads.
Can we ring fence? I mean, can we trust the system though?
Well, you can't trust the system now because the money now goes into the pot.
If they do say they're ring fencing, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where accountability comes in. Accountability and leadership, because, I mean, I think when you have the situation where everybody's passing the buck and you're saying, I don't want to actually be responsible for a project, and I think it's exactly to the point Ian made right at the start, is that you have project managers. Project managers, normally good project managers, will execute the projects. It's a case of saying, I need some leadership to be able to take this project. I want to be held accountable for it. I want a deliverable. You know, we can often say, well, the Gautrain kind of had some moving targets along the way, but at the end of the day, there was a deliverable to it. I think the other thing that hasn't been touched on so much is kind of this politicking around, like the taxis, for instance. You've got this situation where you say, all right, well, everybody pays except so and so. And I think that was one of the things that really irked consumers in general. Was fine, we're all we all agree we need a proper working public transport system, but you can't say that my spend on the road is different from somebody else's. There's got to be a balance there, and I think that's one of the things, again, with the politicking, where communication and an understanding of the project from start to finish needs to be improved.
And you also talk about, you know, if we had to talk about the taxi system, how they actually are such an obstacle to improving infrastructure. They really stand in the way of, you know, the rapid road transport system here in Joburg, here in Gauteng.
100%. And I think if we can get buy-in from all parties, and I think, you know, often Nazir Ali was quoted in the press trying to get this point across that cheaper transport infrastructure would ultimately benefit everybody. But I think, you know, often being, you know, essentially he was screwed over when people said to him, it doesn't apply to these people because we're looking for certain votes around it. And I think that's got to be one of those issues that does need to be addressed, is if we're going to push ahead with it, understand it and communicate it from beginning to end and give us the deliverables.
So it's a good thing that Nazir Ali perhaps is back in the organisation. And do you think that we should change our attitude towards Sanral, perhaps give them the benefit of the doubt and just change the system?
I do think we need to take a gentler view towards Sanral, but also if we look internationally, we're quite spoilt in South Africa in that we haven't had to pay huge tolls and we don't have to pay big fees for our roads. So I'd just like to put it to Ian and say, how would you compare what we pay locally to what foreign people do overseas for their roads?
It's a very important question because people are saying in the media quite often, and government officials, economists and private commentators are saying that it's not that expensive compared with Canada or Australia, where there's an e-toll system in place. That's not quite the truth in a sense, because if you, for example, take home 6,000 Rand a month and you work at a supermarket, and the e-toll system is implemented, and you drive your little second-hand car to work at the local Checkers or Pick n Pay store or whatever it is, you could lose 550 Rand a month of that 6,000 Rand salary to e-tolls. Now that's a lot of money for somebody earning 6,000 Rand. So the rate per kilometre in Rand terms might not be excessively expensive compared with Canada and Australia. But when you look at the salaries that South Africans are earning, we've got the fights at the moment with all the strikes going on because people feel they don't earn enough.
And we talked about the cost of living here last week.
Exactly, and the point is exactly that, is that if you only earn, say, 6,000 Rand a month, 550 Rand a month is actually quite a lot of your salary to spend. Remember, you're still paying the fuel levy. You're paying for your fuel, you're paying the fuel levy, you're paying your car license, you're paying all these other costs, including the cost of the second-hand car and your insurance, which is through the roof. Plus, you now add on another 550 Rand a month. Big chunk of your salary goes on transport. So
we've got to wrap this up, but just before we go, very quickly, do you think that Sanral should have more oversight over more of the roads in South Africa?
I think that the provincial departments have got to get their act together. The Eastern Cape handed 2,000 and something kilometres of roads to Sanral and said, you fix it, but with no money. Sanral can't take unfunded mandates. The provincial departments have got to put proper project managers in place who are qualified and who can repair the roads like the R56 in the Eastern Cape, which is a total disaster. You can't just keep saying to Sanral, oh, you come and fix it. Eventually Sanral will run the whole country. That's ridiculous. You've got to put project managers in every province so that they can actually deliver on the road.